Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to this session of Lit in Colour. My name is Donall Mac Cathmhaoill. I'm a writer and academic, and I will be your host today of this event, featuring the playwright Frances Tournley, author of the play The Great Wave. Lit in Colour is a campaign that the publisher Penguin Books runs in partnership with race equality think tank the Runnymede Trust. Bloomsbury, the publisher of The Great Wave, is a partner of the Lit in Colour campaign, which aims to place a spotlight on plays by contemporary playwrights. The Lit in Colour campaign is all about supporting schools to make the teaching of English and drama more inclusive by focusing on writers of colour. So, as I said, today we will be discussing the play The Great Wave with the author, Frances Tournley. We will have some discussion with Frances, and then we'll be taking some questions from all of you who have logged into our discussion today. So make some notes, have a think about what questions you might want to ask Frances, and we'll take those after the discussion towards the end. We have allowed a lot of time for questions, so please do ask anything that you want to know about, and we'll attempt to answer it. So, Frances Tournley, the writer of The Great Wave, is also a radio dramatist and a screenwriter. He has written several plays for Radio 4, and his stage plays have been produced at numerous theatres across the UK and Ireland. He was a winner of the Channel 4 Playwright Bursary in 2015, and as a result, at that time then, he was playwright in residence at the Kiln Theatre in North London, which was known as the Tricycle at that time. And this culminated in him winning the Catherine Johnson Best Play Award in 2016 for his play, The Great Wave, which then premiered at the National Theatre in 2018. Frances, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Don.
So, good to have you here, Frances. And first off, I'd like to ask you a little bit about your background and your heritage. Like me, you're Irish, right?
Yes, that's correct. From Northern Ireland. My mother's from Japan.
So, okay, great. So you have a shared heritage then, which is both Irish on one side and Japanese on the other. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and that's quite an interesting sort of set of different heritage backgrounds to have, and obviously that's an influence on the play. So we'll come to that later. But first of all, did you always have an ambition to be a writer? Was that something you always thought you'd do?
English literature was always my favourite subject at school, and I gradually segued to thinking about maybe writing a novel, and then I found it easier to write dialogue than prose. So playwriting seemed like a natural medium.
Uh-huh. And have you been writing plays for a long time, or how long have you been doing this?
Maybe just over 30 years.
Right. Okay. So does that mean you've been writing plays since you were still at school, or when did you take it up?
Maybe a little bit afterwards.
Okay. So as a young man, having perhaps started at college or something like that, then you started to write plays.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So let's move on, and we'll talk a little bit about the Great Wave. So where did you get the idea for the play?
I'd read a couple of articles about what was happening at the time, and I thought it would make a really good play. And then I had the chance to write a play at the Tricycle Theatre. So I mentioned 5 or 6 ideas I'd had to write a play, and that was one that most appealed to the then artistic director at the time, Indu Ribasingham.
Okay, and when you say you had read a couple of articles about what was happening, I mean, articles about what specifically? Give us a little bit more, elaborate a little.
It was articles about Japanese going missing in the 1970s, and just the mystery of what happened to them, which I thought would make a really compelling play, a compelling mystery play, as well as a compelling history play.
Uh-huh. And so what was it specifically then was of interest about that, or what did you think? Why did that seem like it was going to make a good play?
I just think the idea of a family member going missing and not knowing what happened to them is compelling, and it doesn't have to be about Japan. It could be any family. It could be any country.
there's an element in it really of a sort of like a almost like a detective story or a mystery. Is that right?
Yes, very much so. It could be seen as a thriller in some ways.
Yeah. Okay. And so then, in terms of the story about a family member going missing, you then set this in a family where there are two teenage girls and their friend who's a teenage boy. How did you develop those characters, or where did you get the ideas for developing those characters?
I kind of loosely based them on, cousins in Japan and used the same name, so it's much easier to get the voice in my head.
Uh-huh. Okay, so Reiko is 18, and her
Yes, that's
sister,
correct.
the one who goes missing, Hanako, is 17, and they have
Yep.
quite a tense relationship. So I'm keen to know who of your inspirations, or where you got the idea of that sort of relationship with those characters.
I wanted to have one sister who's quite studious and the other sister to be quite rebellious, and to give the impression that maybe the studious one would go on to be a teacher and the rebellious one not. But in the end, it was the opposite. It was the rebellious one who became a teacher in North Korea, and the studious one kind of went off the rails a little bit at the beginning. So in a way, their lives kind of swapped a little bit at the beginning.
That's very interesting. So there's a sort of a pivot that happens with those two sisters, where Reiko is the serious one, but actually it's Hanako who becomes the language teacher in the end. Um,
Yes.
okay, and then for example with Tetsuo, the boy character, um, he seems like a slightly ambivalent character. What were the thoughts behind the way you developed his character?
Again, I wanted to show, just how one event can change someone's life. So at the beginning, he's not very studious. He's not going to do very well at school, and he's clearly maybe ending up going to work for his dad's restaurant. But by the end, he's a respected journalist. So again, one event can just change someone's life forever.
Uh-huh. Okay. Um, Now, you have these Japanese characters who are at the sort of core of the thing, and the story starts with them, and then when Hanako is disappears, we move to North Korea, and you've developed these Korean characters. Now that must have presented a different challenge, because obviously you said you had the capacity to base your Japanese characters on people in your wider family from your Japanese heritage, from your Japanese side, your mum's side. So, what were the challenges whenever you were developing the Korean characters?
Uh, there's a society in London called Asia House, and sometimes they would have talks from people who'd escaped from North Korea. So I attended quite a lot of those just to get the idea of what it was like living in North Korea, and just kind of extrapolated an idea to create original characters just based on real North Koreans,
Yeah.
because it's quite hard to meet a real North Korean. But luckily, this society was able to arrange it.
Okay. Now, obviously, with the fact that the North Korean regime are the kidnappers in this story, in the Great Wave, there must have been a risk that your Korean characters wouldn't be as fully developed, or that they would be. I mean, what was your plan for those characters as a writer to make sure that they were three dimensional and credible and in many ways sympathetic?
Well, yes, I mean, a lot of the time in various mediums, North Korea is portrayed as, the enemy, the villain. And I think at the end of the day, they're just normal people. And the idea of creating a nuanced North Korean family appealed to me, rather than just going down the cliched route of, the evil North Korea, good South Korea.
Yeah. Okay. Um, though one of them maybe more interesting characters. You have Jung Sun, who in a sense becomes like a sister to Hanako, but in a sort of ambivalent way. Talk a little bit about that relationship. That must have been interesting to write.
Again, I wanted to show Hannah was missing her sister, and I thought having a North Korean be her enemy at the start, but gradually they become friends over the course of the play, and just showing how their lives almost become the opposite of each other. Jung Sun has to pretend she's Japanese, and Hanako has to pretend she's North Korean. So in a way, they're sharing, they're going through the same thing, but from different points of view.
Excellent. That's a really interesting insight. Now, when Hanako is in North Korea, they choose a partner for her, and she marries Kum Chol and has a child. Kum
Yeah.
Chol, who is her Korean husband, he seems like a kind of a bit of a feckless, not a very solid, dependable character. He kind of betrays his family toward the end, and yet then he comes good. Explain to me what you were trying to do there now with that characterization.
I guess the origin of that character was just showing someone having post-traumatic stress disorder and having to go through his family being taken to the North Korean labor camps and set free, and just how he tries to get his life together. And in a way, he and Hanako were put together by the government, and they're not expected to fall in love, and yet they do, and they have a child. And by the end, he goes from being maybe an untrustworthy character to someone who makes the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of his family.
It's interesting that there's also parallels between Kum Chol and Tetsuo, the two men. So the Tetsuo is the Japanese man, and Kum Chol, the Korean man. Both start looking like they're a bit undependable or untrustworthy, or maybe not very solid or whatever, and ultimately then they become really strong and sort of reliable characters. Okay, well, there's obviously quite an interesting story in the background there, but what's really interesting about this play is the structure. So you've got a structure where there's two worlds, two countries. How did you approach writing that now?
I guess like North Korea is a bit of a mystery to some people, and still is to this day. And I thought exploring that would be really interesting. And at the same time, I wanted to show a different view of Japan as well, maybe shown through, a family where it's just one mother looking after two daughters, which I don't see very often.
Mm. And
In a way, the family's about various kinds of families.
mm, yeah, there's an interesting kind of switch back and forth then. So we start in Japan, and then it's only after the abduction that we then the play goes to Korea, isn't that right? And then, but then for the rest of the play, it moves backwards and forwards, isn't that right?
Yes.
You have two parts to the play. So the play is part one, part two. Can you tell us what's really happening there, or why you thought it was necessary to have it divided like that?
I just thought it was interesting. I mean, I almost treated it like a film thriller script. So instead of having Act One, Act Two, one day the director just said Part Two, and I thought, that was interesting. So ever since then, I've always ended plays with parts rather than acts.
Hmm. Okay. So then the play was a great success at the Dorfman Theatre as in the National Theatre in London in March 2018. I saw it there. It was great. I really enjoyed it. Can you talk a little bit about the staging and what it looked like on the stage in terms of the sets and everything, so that the students can get some idea of that?
Yes, we had a very experienced designer, Tom Piper, who'd worked a lot with the director Indu Ribasingham, and he'd said very early on that because the play had so many short scenes, that it was really important to have really quick scene changes. So he used a revolve stage, which really helped with that. And I think with this play, it's important to have forward momentum and not to slow things down. It should be going back and forth like waves between North Korea and Japan to keep the thriller element up rather than things down, which didn't work. So we realized early on in rehearsals that it was good to speed it up as quickly as possible. So the revolve was used a great deal during the play and worked out very well.
Now that's interesting, because you've said something there that points to the design ideas that Tom Piper had, and also to your ideas as a writer, which is about waves. So the way the play washes backwards and forwards between Japan and Korea, that in a way represents the waves, and obviously there's big waves and the storm at the very start of the play, which is the big incident that sets the play off. But so was it very deliberate for you then to have this idea of waves in the movement between scenes?
I never really seen that before, and I thought it was a good way to segue between Japan and North Korea. And I'd originally written it like that, but when I saw Tom set, I decided to keep it, and he said it helped him a great deal imagine how to reflect the waves on stage. So it was kind of a combination of sound by the sound designer Alex Kaplan, and also using projection as well, which worked out very well.
By Luke Halls, I believe, the videographer.
Yes, very good.
And the script of the play very clearly states quite often at the end of a scene or the start of a scene, it gives directions for what the weather is like or what the sounds of the weather is like. Was that something that was reproduced in the stage production?
A little bit. Sometimes the director would take elements of the scene directions, and sometimes she wouldn't. And it's what she extrapolated from what I'd written. Worked out very well. If she'd literally tried to direct every scene description, it would have been a very long play.
Yeah. Okay. One last thing then, just on staging and production, just a quick question, which is many of the students who are watching this and the teachers there are thinking, oh, but we don't have a revolve. So if you've got any ideas for them in terms of how you would recommend that they approach those scene changes if they don't have a big fancy.
A lot of the time, if you don't have a large budget, just lighting changes can work really well to show that you're in a different world or a different country. You only really need two spotlights, so it's quite easy to do.
Yeah, and obviously there are other things that are very different. So the costume is very obvious when you're in North Korea because everybody is wearing the official sort of government costume. So some of those things perhaps are clues as well. Okay, so there's one of the things that's really a big theme in the play is this idea of swapping identity and of fusing with your new identity. And that's often related, obviously, to the language and culture of North Korea and of Japan. So can you tell us how that works in terms of what happens with the characters, the main characters, and their questions of language and cultural identity?
Well, originally Hanako, is told off at the start of the play because she's misbehaving during her language exam and making an origami rabbit, and in a way she has to learn North Korean by being forced to, and she becomes a teacher almost by default. Whereas Jung Sun, also like Hanako, doesn't initially take to learning Japanese, but by the end becomes fluent. And I think language can really show how someone can become a different person, but also in the way that they act, how they dress. In Japan in the 70s, obviously fashion is very colorful, and in North Korea people literally just wore the same Mao outfit. So I thought it was interesting to have a North Korean suddenly have a colorful outfit, and then Hanako to have Jung Sun's outfit. So they almost swap identities.
Yeah, by swapping language, by swapping clothing, by swapping names.
Everything.
Yeah, so Hanako gets a Korean name, and obviously Jung Sung gets a Japanese name. Yeah, it's a very striking moment actually when Jung Sung comes on stage in the Western dress, in the Japanese dress. Obviously now, this is something that theatre seems to do fairly well, which is explore these questions of identity and history and so forth. What is it about theatre? Why is theatre so good at that, do you think?
I think it's a lot to do with acting and becoming different people, and people are attracted to the idea of seeing people go through changes. And I think with the most successful plays, the people at the very end are very different people to how they were at the beginning of the play, like with the Great Wave.
Yeah. So in particular, when you talk about theatre, you're talking about a form or a medium where it's automatically about impersonating and about costuming and changing your identity all the way through. So actually, it becomes a good sort of way to look at issues like that. Um, okay, very good. I think that's also something that's very relevant then to the Lit in Colour series, because actually Lit in Colour is a series of plays for students by people of colour who are based in the UK for the most part. I think I haven't spotted any that aren't UK based. So quite often we're talking about people like yourself who have a heritage from somewhere else. So you have family heritage which is Irish, but also which is Japanese and East Asian. And so in terms then of the Lit in Colour series, it's what's interesting to you about that? Why how does it feel for you to be picked as one of those writers?
Yeah, it's a real honour to be, on the list, and I know a lot of other playwrights are on it as well, and we think there's a sea change coming where more and more audiences are more open to watching or seeing plays that are, set in a different country or from a different culture, and I can see that happening more and more in plays in London and further afield.
Yeah, and actually, ultimately, it's reflective of the people who are studying the plays, because obviously the populations in right across the UK and Ireland are, the schools are full of people of all sorts of different heritages and backgrounds and ethnicities. So, okay, well then, in terms of the questions around identity and fitting in, which is a big part of the Great Wave. How does that relate to your own personal story, growing up as a boy, going to school in Ireland and having friends, and being, I'm going to guess, apart from your brother, maybe the only Japanese kid in the school? Is that right, or Japanese Irish kid in the school?
That's correct, yes.
So how do the themes of the play then do they reflect a little bit of your own experience? Tell us a little bit about that.
I mean, a little bit. I mean, at the time, there wouldn't have been a lot of plays similar to Lit in Colour on the syllabus. It was mostly, from memory, people like Samuel Beckett, George Bernard Shaw, obviously Shakespeare, and I think that's changed a lot today, just with what's on the GCSE drama syllabus, and also on the GCSE English literature syllabus, which reflects a lot more of the diverse cultural society we live in today.
Yeah. So, but and then in terms of your own personal experience, do you think that was an influence on the writing of the Great Wave?
I mean, a little bit. I think Northern Ireland, obviously, it's not the same as North Korea, but it's, we've got Northern Ireland and the South of Ireland and North Korea and South Korea. People having different opinions of who lives in which country, and how there's, I guess, some crossover. But at the end of the day, I just think students have a lot more opportunity to read plays that are set further afield.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, we'll have a couple more sort of general questions before we get on to inviting questions from the audience. So, are there any particular writers or plays or fiction writers, for that matter, that you're particularly fond of yourself, or people who've been an inspiration to you?
I mean, just recently, I've kind of re-admired the work of Florian Zeller. He originally did The Father at the Tricycle when I was working there, and he went on to do The Son and The Mother. And again, a lot of his plays are based around families and family members, which I think, some of the best plays are based on a family or revolve around a family, like with The Great Wave.
Uh-huh. Yeah. It is a family story, in the very obvious way, which is about the family, Etsuko's family, which is Reiko, Hanako, but also it's about family in a bigger sense, isn't it? The Great Wave, in terms of Hanako's experiences.
Yes, she goes on to have her own unorthodox family in North Korea, and even though it's obviously something she never imagined would happen, she wouldn't give up her daughter, even if she had the chance to go back to how things were. she had a daughter that she loves. I think even a terrible thing can sometimes end up having a positive effect.
Yeah. Okay. And so then, whenever you're apart from Florian Zeller, are there other writers or novelists, playwrights that you like or that you would recommend to young uh, readers in and
I'd
around
recommend
the?
the American playwright Lynn Nottage, who I think is doing great work. She wrote a play
Mhm.
called Ruined, which is set in the Congo. I think that's worth, for me, it's like a masterpiece, and I think it's worth a lot of students checking out her work. But I'd start with that play in particular.
Yeah, she also had a really good play on recently in London called Clyde's,
Yep,
which was set in a diner, and it's about a group of people who have all got themselves criminal records working in a diner, in a sort of like a fast food joint. And it's a really, really lovely play, a lovely piece of work. And one of her plays is actually on the Lit in Colour list, Sweat, which I've got here. Um,
yes,
so
another
I
excellent
knew
play. Yeah.
another excellent play. So Lynn Nottage, she's probably at this moment the most exciting playwright in operating in the US, or certainly one of the most successful. Okay, and then to date, the National Theatre production has possibly been one of the high points of your career. Was there anything about the production there that you didn't like, or anything you would change, or was there any aspect of it that you thought were really good, that you thought they were exceptional, that you want to mention?
I don't think there's anything that I'd want to change. I thought the actors, it was really interesting to have a mixture of Japanese, Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean actors all on stage, and a lot of them have gone on to great things. And I hope that maybe one day there'll be a revival with the next generation of young actors.
I think it's important to say also that you were the first writer of East Asian heritage ever to have a play on at the National Theatre. Is that correct?
As far as I know, that's correct. It was very exciting.
As far as I know, that's correct. So, congratulations to you on that. That's quite an achievement. But hopefully, there's going to be a lot more plays now in the future from people of all heritages and backgrounds. Okay, and then just briefly, once you'd done the play there, it went to the US, didn't it?
Yes, it did. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
It was a really interesting time. It was at the Berkeley Rep in near San Francisco. Again, it was that had a very large East Asian population, so a lot of the audience were Korean and Japanese, which was less so in the national, where there's not as big a population in London.
Okay. Right. Well, look, we're going to wind up soon, but if you were bearing in mind that you've got lots of students watching this, and probably many others will come and watch it later whenever it goes up on the internet. Um, what are the important things that you would like to for students to take away from the experience of exploring your play?
I'd like to think that they'd be more open to reading and studying plays set in countries that they don't know, not necessarily Japan, but as with Lynn Nottage, Ruin set in the Congo, Clyde's is set in, I think, an American city, possibly Chicago, and not just restrict themselves to sticking to the usual Shakespeare texts, great as they are. I think there's a lot more interesting work there coming out at the minute, but also from 10, 20 years ago.
And if you could say, if there's any message in the play itself in terms of the themes, what's the important takeaway, do you think, from the Great Wave?
Just the importance of, believing that, your family can come together even though something terrible happens.
And that's something I suppose that all families experience one way or other. Yeah.
In different
Okay.
ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a very strong message there, and it's in the play also, which is that whenever you encounter a different culture or an alien culture, that it's only temporarily alien to you, and that if you're determined to understand or to experience that culture, you can get to know it really, really profoundly, and in many ways identify with it.
Yes, that's
Um,
correct. I mean, initially when she meets the Koreans, she thinks they're, the enemy, and but over the course of the play, she realizes that Jung Sun's just like her. Her dad actually is revealed he's Jung Sun's father. So by the end of the play, people realize that the North Koreans are equally, a family as well, and I think that's important. Even with the
yeah,
government officials as well, they're not just cliched characters. They should be seen as you know fully realized characters, which I think students should follow up on with other text.
yeah. I would argue that there's a similar idea that goes with the entire Lit in Colour series, and is a really important thing in our culture generally, which is that actually, you know, many of the writers that we're talking about, people like yourself and me to some extent, we are. We are from a slightly different culture. I live in England. You live you divide your time between England and Ireland, and the culture that we're in is a very diverse culture, and it's a great thing that it's diverse, because that means that we can get to know a little bit about the lives of people from all over the world if we're determined to go out there and experience it.
Yes, yes, I agree.
Okay.
I mean, even in London, there's so much to watch, but you can watch it online on NT Live or various streaming platforms. So I think things are much better than they were, even 10 years ago.
Hmm. Okay, well, what we'll do now, I think, is we will see if there are some questions from the people who are taking part in, who have come along to watch and to to take part in the discussion today. So we have a question here about your process of writing, Francis. So when you write, how much do you envisage what the stage production will look like when you're writing? Do you have a picture in your head?
Sure. I mean, if I was researching through magazines or books or from the internet, I'd print out images that might resonate with me and stick them on the wall for inspiration. For instance, the Great Wave, the famous painting by Hokusai was an influence on the play as well. So I'd look at that every day, and it kind of inspired me to write.
So you create like a mood board or a picture board or an image
Exactly, yeah,
board.
like a collage with maybe actors you see in your head who could play certain parts, or pictures of people from the time, the fashion of the time, the architecture of the time, and that just helps you get in the right frame of mind before starting. I find that helps a great deal.
Interesting, because that's also a process that set designers and costume designers in theatre use, where they will get lots and lots and lots of visual references, maybe images off the internet, or online sources, where they will put them in an online folder. You prefer the more old-fashioned way of having an actual physical paper board, is that right?
Yeah, I do that for all my plays.
Okay, very good. That's possibly something that students and teachers might want to think about in terms of the play. There's a really nice division in the play between the two worlds, the North Korean word, the Japanese word. So there is the potential there to develop a set of visual resources around sets and costumes and actual character looks, I suppose, as well, for both those worlds. Okay, that's very interesting. Okay, another question then. How did you get into playwriting? How did it all start?
I mean, as I said before, I've always been more comfortable writing dialogue than prose, and writing for the radio. I started out writing a bit for Radio 4, which I found quite liberating, because you don't really need a budget for radio. You can, write something set in space or, war, and the budget's always the same because it's just based on sound effects, which is why the Great Wave has a lot of sound as well, which I think I borrowed a lot from audio and writing for radio for several years.
So, what was the first breakthrough moment then? How did you get that first breakthrough?
I started out writing a few plays for the Fringe in London, and a radio producer from Radio 4 thought one would make a good stage play, which in the end didn't happen, but I managed to write for something else. It was the Saturday play on Radio 4, a thriller set in Northern Ireland, and that was the start of me writing, I guess, for 10 years for Radio 4 for various programs like the afternoon play, the Saturday play, plays like that.
Okay, so but the breakthrough was a stage play on the London Fringe. Is that right?
Yes, that's great. Yeah.
And what was that? Or tell us a little bit more. Was it just very small, modest, first time work, or?
Yeah, it's a very small play in a Fringe theatre in King's Cross, which doesn't exist anymore. It was about a couple and the woman was dying, and the husband decided to hire a hitman to kill them both. And for some reason, him and the hitman ended up becoming friends, and it was just the awkwardness of the hitman having to kill him. So it had kind of like a happy sad ending in the end.
It sounds very good. I think you should revive it. Okay, then the follow-on question there was, have you any tips for any young people who would be getting involved in writing or want to go along a similar path?
I mean, at the time I'd read a lot of stage plays, but I think now things have changed a lot. I think there's a lot of crossover between mediums. Stranger Things has opened on the West End. I think people are more open to science fiction and fantasy on stage. I think it's only a matter of time before that happens with, computer games, social media, TikTok, things like that. I mean, in a way, people playing interactive games, that's almost like you're creating a character already, and you're creating your own stories. I think it hasn't happened yet, but I think it's only a matter of time before that crosses over, like it has with television and film.
So yeah, all those gamers out there who are watching this. In a sense, computer games or video games are a new narrative medium. They're a new form of narrative, and actually, with TV shows like The Last of Us, we have seen that actually those stories can make really good drama as well. So, but what would you one tip for a writer who's starting out, a young person who's maybe 15, 16 years old, who's watching this and they want to be a playwright? What should they do?
I think with dialogue is the key to writing plays, and I wouldn't try to be like another playwright. Obviously Harold Pinter writes in a certain way, Beckett writes in a certain way, but I found that if you just write the way people say, it's much easier to write a play. The language flows a lot quicker, so I always write that on my wall. Just write what people say, and even if the play's too long, you can edit it down. I think that'd probably be the most important thing.
If I could add my own suggestion to your tip, one thing that you could do if you really want to be a playwright is go and see a lot of plays, because it's a great thing to do and it can be such fun. Okay, next question. How do you imagine the play coming to life in the classroom? So how would you suggest that the people might bring your play to life in the classroom?
I think it would be interesting to split the classroom in two, with one half being North Korea, the other half having been characters in Japan, and you could swap that around the next day. And when you're reading characters, I think it would give students the opportunity to be characters in North Korea and also in Japan, and just to experience the different points of view. I think potentially that would be an interesting way to do things.
And you could expand that, where you might want to put a sea in between the two, where you would clear a space, and that would be a gap, a space that represents the sea.
Sure, depending on the size of the classroom, that could work really well. And at the same time, a lot of the scenes take place at the same time, so you would have students on the right-hand side doing the North Korean scenes, and people on the left-hand side doing the Japanese scenes.
A lot of schools also now do have sort of like drama studio spaces, which are set up so that they're kind of an open space to work in. Okay, we have another question. You like writing dialogue. How do you develop pace and rhythm through your plays? Do you place the most importance on dialogue when creating mood and atmosphere? So the question is about dialogue. How do you get that pace, the rhythm, the atmosphere?
Initially my plays would be very long. The initial draft of The Great Wave was, I think, 300 pages, and it was obviously too long. But if you keep cutting and editing it down, you kind of find a natural rhythm in your head, and then the next is when you hear actors reading your lines aloud, and then you find out what works, what doesn't work, and you keep editing it right up until press night.
Okay. And do you tend to use actors then in your process? So, for example, would you, if you were working on a play, would you want to get a group of people together to do a reading of a work in progress, or do you wait until later, or how does it work?
Sometimes I'll do that, but a lot of the time I just read it aloud, read it literally aloud to myself.
Right. Okay. I almost could hear a huge sigh of relief back from thousands of students whenever you said the play was once 300 pages long and you cut it down. I'm sure there's lots of students saying, "Thank goodness I didn't have to study a 300-page version of your play."
All right.
But so, and then in terms of creating mood and atmosphere, is dialogue the most important thing, or how important is dialogue in creating mood and atmosphere?
I think it's a combination of dialogue, but a lot of it is just the general setting as well, and what you write, where it's set, just the way the characters, I guess, are with each other, the way they're dressed, the time something's set. If it's happening during a war, or if it's happening at times of peace, that adds a lot to it as well.
Yeah. And I think also in your play, then, as you've said, in the production, the sound effects, the video effects, and projections were really important as well in terms of mood and atmosphere. Isn't that? Would you agree?
I would. I mean, I think you do need all those things to make the play work, but equally, I've seen the play just read as a reading, and it has the same effect on people listening as well. So I don't think you need the whole bells and whistles for this play. You can equally do a much more muted version, which would work just as well.
Okay, very good. Important. Right. All right. How do you know when a rough draft of a play is worth pursuing, and when you should put that idea aside?
A lot of the time, when I'm kind of like getting towards the end, I will maybe read it loud with some actors just to see what it sounds like and keep cutting it. But at some point, you're going to have to submit it to the literary manager or a director, to get their take on it, and you take their comments on board. And if everyone has the same critical comments, that normally means that's the area you have to fix.
So, are there a lot of people involved in that process, or do you have one or two trusted friends, or how
I
does
think
it
with a
work?
lot of playwrights, they will ask certain friends to read their play just to get an honest take of it. Because obviously, if you sent it to a family member, they're going to go, "It's a great play." You don't really know. If you send it to a friend who just wants you to have a good feeling, they'll say it's great. You have to send it to someone who's not afraid to say, "This play is terrible. This doesn't work. That character doesn't work." But I think a lot of playwrights have got, I guess they're called, I don't know, theatre wingmen, I think they're called.
Right. Okay. I'll remember that. Okay, a couple more questions. How did you find your own particular voice and style as a writer?
I mean, I guess over the years it gradually emerges. I mean, at the start, like with everyone, my early plays were a bit all over the place, kind of jumping between different genres, thriller, crime, science fiction, and you just find yourself alighting on certain characters, certain themes, certain genres. So I like writing for the thriller genre quite a lot. I also like, the fantasy genre, but equally, I'd read maybe a newspaper article and think that would make a really good play. So I like to jump between different genres.
But yet you always find a way into it that's really a Francis Turley type way in, isn't that so? Wouldn't you say?
Perhaps a little bit. I think I do tend to alight on maybe siblings as a way forward into exploring a play, and sometimes they might change from two sisters or two brothers, or it could just be like a husband and wife going through an extraordinary situation, like with the first play about which we discussed.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that family was a really important theme, but actually, families are important themes in almost every piece of literature ever written. So that's a really interesting lens to put on the Great Wave. Okay, Are there any plays you would consider studying alongside The Great Wave to give some comparison on themes and such like?
I don't know if it's a play, but there's a very good film called Tokyo Story, which I think is worth students watching. It's about an elderly couple who visit, their family in Tokyo and how they're treated, and that gave me a really good insight into family. And obviously, it's a film, not a stage play, but that's always had a big effect. I mean, I did return to it a lot when I was writing The Great Wave.
Interesting. Tokyo Story. Is that who's the director of that? Do you know off the top of your
He's
head?
called Uzo.
Ozu. Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
a sort of a classic of Japanese cinema. Um, Another one that I would just mention, although it's an American director, Sofia Coppola, is Lost in Translation, because it's very much from the point of view of two Americans in Tokyo for the first time, and they don't speak Japanese. Actually, it's got a lot of themes in common about being a fish out of water and being in a different culture and not being local, not understanding the language, and actually, it's a really lovely film and. Hopefully the kind of film that Sofia Coppola is known for doing films that are very centered or focused often on young protagonists. So quite often her films get a great response from young audiences. So that's one just to maybe as a tip for
All
the
right.
teachers.
I
Okay.
think the Lives of Others, another film, is worth checking out. Set in a communist country, which was helpful for me researching North Korea. And again, I read Ruined a lot when I was writing The Great Wave, which is a play I keep returning to.
Yeah. So The Lives of Others is a German film that's set in the DDR, the German Democratic Republic, as it was before the wall came down, and it was a communist country, and it's about the state spying on its citizens, really. So that's a good reference. Thanks for that. And the other one you said there, Francis, was the Lynn Nottage play,
Ruined, yeah, the
Ruined.
one we talked about.
Yeah. Okay. Good show. Right. We have one more question here. You mentioned that some of the stage directions were ignored in the National Theatre production. How important are stage directions, and are they ever the most important thing?
I think it depends on the director. With the text for The Great Wave, I guess I overdid it a little bit with the stage direction, so the director had to extrapolate what she thought was best. But I mean, equally, some writers are very precious about stage directions. But if a director says, we can lose this or lose that, a lot of the time, just from their natural instinct, they're correct, and it's always good to go with the director's vision rather than what you've got in your head. Or sometimes it's kind of a combination of the two. And often, as long as you've got a good relationship with the director, I think there's give and take on both sides.
Yeah, I think you probably have to trust the director if you're going to be working with them. And you obviously had a good relationship with Indu Rubasingam, who's the artistic director of the National Theatre. What if your stage directions relate to physical action? So they're not about, say, weather effects or sound effects. They're about something that's happening there where there's no dialogue.
Yep.
Would you be more insistent then about keeping the directions correct?
A little bit. I mean, in the play, there's a bit where soldiers emerge and try to take away the daughter, and that seems very heavily dependent on scene directions, which we did almost stick to every scene direction with that. And a lot of the time with plays, you don't even need dialogue. A lot of the time, scene direction and what people are doing is enough in itself to compel an audience.
Yeah. And that scene is, of course, really powerful because it sort of comes right at the crisis of the play, and it's Hanako's little daughter Hana is at risk of being taken away. Very exciting
Yep.
stuff. Okay, if you were writing this story now, would you change anything?
Um, I don't think so. I mean, at the time, things were very tense between North Korea and South Korea, and things are always up and down there. But I don't think I necessarily change anything now.
Yeah. Um, would you ever consider writing a similar sort of a place, but set in a different, not Korea and Japan, but maybe somewhere else? Are there
Sure. I
other?
mean, I think it'd be interesting to do a play, set in Northern Ireland. A family play, which I've always wanted to do. But at the minute I'm mostly writing different genres like science fiction and fantasy, but one day I would like to write about where I grew up. Yes.
Okay, very good. We look forward to seeing that when the time comes. Um, if you if you were to be writing a play that was set in Northern Ireland along similar themes, have you any ideas of the are there themes around, say, for example, Northern Ireland has changed a lot, and there are lots of people
Yeah.
of different ethnicity now. There is there are there stories in there? Do you think?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a really interesting story in a there's a famous war photographer who went to Northern Ireland and took some great photos. I think his book comes out in October, and he was like a Japanese guy who just ended up in the troubles in Northern Ireland and took some of the best photos. And it's just looking into how a guy ended up there. And I think I'd like to research his life and write a play about him one day.
Okay, do we know the name of that photographer
Oh,
off the top of our head?
I can't remember his name now, but there's recently an article in the Guardian about him.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. And do you yourself go back to Japan very often, or is it just every for major family events? Or
I tend to go back mostly for family events. I'm going back next month, but normally it would be relatives visiting rather than me going.
okay, so that your relatives come over from Japan to Northern Ireland.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure they find that interesting. What do they have to say whenever they see what Ireland's like?
They mostly say it's just very very cold.
Right. Okay, another question. Who's your favourite character in The Great Wave? Um, in terms of which character do you most enjoy writing?
I like writing the character of Tetsuo. I'd kind of based him a little bit on there's a famous manga anime called Akira, where one of the characters is called Tetsuo, and I just thought it'd be funny to imagine what he'd be like in stage play.
Yeah, Akira is Akira is a great film. Absolutely one of my favourites. Quite old now. It's maybe 25 years old or something, but really good.
Yep.
And then, who's your favourite character when you're watching the play?
I actually quite like the official because we never actually give him a name, and at the beginning you think he's a villain of the piece, and by the end you actually realize he's a father and that he has a daughter, and he's just one of these guys who keeps popping up, and in a way he becomes a father figure to Hanako. So I always like watching different actors' interpretations of him.
Yeah, the official, which is the name of the character for the students who aren't familiar at this stage. The official is a really subtly written character. So compliments on that, Francis, because we don't get an explicit. We're not explicitly told that he has these negative feelings about North Korea or about the great leader or the state that he lives in, but we get these hints, and he's a very subtly kind of ambivalent character. Would you say that's right?
Yes, I think at the beginning, he seems like he's the personification of North Korea, but by the very end, you can kind of see him disagreeing with, what they're all about, given what happened to his daughter, which I've always found that just came naturally over the course of the play. Originally, he just was unofficial, but by the time the play came out, a lot of people said they saw their father in him.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to watch because he evolves quite substantially, but very quietly in the background. So certainly, if students are looking at the characters in the play, he would be an interesting one to look at and just to see how he changes from the first page to the last.
Yes, I agree.
Okay. Well, look, we're pretty much, there are no other questions just coming in right now. So, are there any tips you would give to the students, Francis, yourself, for studying the play? Things you would recommend that they look at? So, I suggest that maybe they might want to follow the official. Are there things that you would suggest they look at that might be of interest to them?
I think it'd be enjoyable if they even watched films from 70s Japan, 80s Japan, and even if it's no use for the play, I think they'd enjoy them a great deal. With regards to North Korea, it's obviously a lot harder to to watch anything about North Korea, but I think even just looking to the history of North Korea would be useful when studying the play.
There's quite a lot of history there, but that's not something we're going to get into in any depth here. So apart from then the history, any other things you think that would be important to keep their eye on when they're reading The Great Wave?
The play's available on NT Collection, so their schools should be able to show them the original production at the National from 2018. So I think it'd be useful to maybe better to watch it after they've read the play, so they can form their own idea in their head and then see how it actually turned out.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, I think that pretty much covers. Sorry. I think that pretty much covers everything that we had hoped to talk about in the session. I thank you so much, Francis. You've given us some great insights there into the story and the characters and the themes of The Great Wave, and you've told us about the National Theatre production. And I hope that has given the students and teachers some ideas about how they might approach the play. I myself saw it in 2018 at the National Theatre. I found it really enjoyable. We hope that the students and the teachers will have a lot of fun with this play, because actually there's lots of really great opportunities for a school group in the play. We've got a group of young teenagers who are at the heart of the story, and there's a lovely movement through the play as they develop and grow into adulthood. So it just remains really for me to say I'd like to thank you, Francis Townley, for being with us today. Great to talk to you. Thank you for all your insights. I would also like to thank the Runnymede Trust, Penguin Books, and Bloomsbury Publishing for making it all happen. I strongly recommend to the teachers that you look at the full Lit in Colour list, which is widely available. I'm sure that you have been sent that already. Most importantly then, just to finish, I would like to thank the most important people here. That is the students and teachers who have come along to be in the audience today. So thank you so much for coming along and taking part. We wish you much pleasure in your study of The Great Wave, which I'm sure you'll all find to be a really fantastic play. Do check it out if you can on the NT feed. I'm not sure if it's on the Drama Online Library, but it's certainly available through the NT. And yes, enjoy the play and good luck with your studies. Best of luck with all of it, and thanks again. So it's goodbye from Francis Townley. Bye. And it's goodbye from me, Donall Mac Cathmhaoill. Thanks again. Goodbye.
It's great. Thank you.